or should I say hello? We just had a photo shoot at work for headshots, and this was my favorite, even though it was an accident. So as Mark mentioned, I do work for Salesforce, and the product that I work on is the Lightning Design System. But before I get started talking about all that, I wanted to say thank you to all of you, and thank you to Mark, and thank you to everyone at the event, because I'm really excited to be here. I'm really honored to be here. Super jet lagged though, so bear with me. Yeah, so design systems. Anyone that knows me knows I really love design systems. I've been kind of evangelizing them for quite a good part of my speaking career. And when people say design systems, there's a lot of different things people think about when they hear design systems. I love collecting mid-century design systems, like graphic standards manuals from the 70s. Probably the two most well-known ones that are re-released right now through Kickstarter are the New York City Transit Authority, as well as the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, otherwise known as NASA. But these days, when people are talking about design systems, it's usually in the context of software or product design for the web. And so some of the really well-known ones that have been out lately, Apple has their HIG, or Human Interface Guidelines. You've got Google with the Material Design Guidelines. You even have Lonely Planet with Rizzo. You've got Harmony with, or Intuit with Harmony. The United States government basically has a design system through the agency known as 18F. I'm a huge fan of the work that they do. The one that I work on. There's also Carbon by IBM. You got Polaris through Shopify, and Microsoft just announced theirs, which is called Fluent. Lots of companies are putting their design systems out, and they're kind of like all the rage right now. I just want to very briefly kind of talk about how I got into them and why I love them so much. So my first style guide that I created was as an intern at a design agency in Memphis, Tennessee. The agency was called Odin, and it was basically, there's a card game called Bridge, and it was a group of basically bridge players, and they were redesigning their site. And so I made a style guide for it. And in the style guide, I was documenting the brand, I was documenting the CSS, I was documenting grid, all that stuff. But this was done in Quark. I know, you probably haven't heard that word used in a while. It's done in Quark, and it was output as a PDF. Obviously not the type of design system I'm going to be talking about today. The next one I worked on was when I was at Apple. Oops, I'm one slide behind. Okay. The next one that I worked on was when I was at Apple. I was on the online store team, and we had a lot of different shared patterns and components, and so I was starting to document this type of stuff. And it got me really interested in doing this for the web, so much so that I shared my excitement on Instapart. But even when I wrote this, I was kind of really still dealing with PDFs or dealing with wikis or putting them on like a WordPress. I also worked at a design agency after that where I was doing a lot of brand guidelines for our different clients at Crush and Lovely. But it wasn't until I worked at Engine Yard, which was a Ruby-based company, that I really started exploring putting these online. And this was also my first time using Sass. I used to write CSS and think that I didn't need Sass. And so I was learning Sass, and I was starting a new job at the company, so I wanted to really learn the UI. So I was documenting all the different patterns and components and refactoring the CSS and learning Sass all at the same time. And I wrote a little bit about that on the blog, which was right about the time that I started noticing other people were doing this too, and it was really exciting for me. So since then, pretty much every job I've had ever since, I'm always like advocating and like trying to convince everybody that you need a design system. I did it at Do, which was my first team that I joined at Salesforce. It was a small like startup that Salesforce used to own. It's now, we like to say in San Francisco, sunsetted, which is a really pleasant way of saying they shut it down. But when I was there, I was doing a lot of mobile design, and I found that I couldn't really do an online style guide for mobile in the same way I was doing for HTML because I don't know how to code for mobile. So I was doing a lot of redlining, and yeah, these are very painful to make. I did a little side project while I was working at Do, where I actually took on the design responsibility for the website and brand for SaaS, because I got like so into SaaS from when I worked at Engine Yard that I pretty much like went all in on the community. And for this one, I am still one slide behind. Sorry about that. For this one, I did an online style guide. And because it was an open source website, I was really concerned about the style guide being up to date. You know, if somebody was going to add a color, like a new variable, they're probably not going to remember to go to the style guide and update it. So I was exploring with using, you know, YAML to generate my SAS variables and all that. And then that kind of led me to where I am now, which is at Salesforce. Technically was at Salesforce already, but like, when I say at Salesforce, I mean like joining the core team. And what brought me there was I saw this style guide, which came out like 3 or 4 years ago, and it was for their Salesforce One app. And I thought it was really pretty. And this was the type of work I'd been trying to convince some of the other companies that I worked at, and nobody would take me up on it. Nobody would join me on the effort. Nobody would use it. Nobody would adopt it. So when I saw that a big company like Salesforce was putting a style guide out, I was like, well, hey, this sounds pretty much like a dream job. So I switched teams, and right at that time, Do was sunsetted, so it was like really good timing. The Lightning Design System is basically what has evolved from that Salesforce One style guide. But I'm going to pause for a moment to ask really quick, like, does anyone watch Game of Thrones? I love Game of Thrones, and there's a metaphor that I really love to use internally that I'm going to talk about, and it's about dragons. So I view the design system that I'm working on right now with an amazing team like a dragon, and I'll explain why. So if you've watched this show, you know there was like this cute little like pretty dragon egg, and in the show, like people basically collected these, and nobody really expected an actual dragon would come from these eggs. They were kind of considered like relics. And then you have like, when they're hatched, you have these really cute little cat-sized dragons, and they're really adorable. And then they become monster-sized, and they basically burn everything down. That kind of sounds really negative, but like I'll explain further like what I mean by that. So let's talk about the egg mode of design systems. Usually this is when a company is like really just starting out with their design system. The goal for this is usually to invest in having a more efficient team. So part of that process is gathering. So when I talk about gathering, I'm talking about like getting all the information that you need before you even get started. I really love this comic by XKCD, where it says, situation, there are 14 competing standards. 14 ridiculous, we need one universal standard. Situation, there are now 15 competing standards. Standards like this proliferate all the time in companies because there's no actual meaningful value or like vision sought out at the beginning. So last year at Clarity, my design system conference, there was a talk given by Isaac Hayes and Donna Chan, who work for AppDirect, and they talked about using basic user research practices before you begin your style guide, and that way you have a more meaningful, useful style guide. And one of the people from Adobe attended the conference, and they actually wrote a fantastic summary of that talk. These links will be shared later, so you can get them later. But they did a really great breakdown of that process, and I'm sharing it because this process that they went through is really super similar to the way we did it at Salesforce. It basically involves identifying who all your different users and builders and stakeholders, interviewing them, and then taking like bits of basically like things that you notice surface up a lot, and then defining like what your principles are, and then using that to define what your stories are going to be for your roadmap. So principles, I think, are really important, and I think it's really important that your principles are developed through the user research that you're doing. So when we defined our principles, we kind of did a similar process. You know, we did our interviews and we tried to identify like what was important to us, and then we did the whole sticky note categorizing and moving things around, and then finally landed on 4 principles. And the way we kind of do everything is we always stack rank our list, and so these principles are stack ranked in order of importance. So the first one, the images you're seeing on these slides are landmarks in San Francisco. Our intern designed these, and then we ended up hiring him because he's awesome. So the first principle is clarity. It's actually a total coincidence that my conference is named Clarity. I bought my domain like 2 years before we landed on these. But yeah, so clarity says that we want to eliminate ambiguity, enable people to see, understand, and act with confidence. The second principle is efficiency. Streamline and optimize workflows, intelligently anticipate needs to help people work better, smarter, and faster. And then consistency. I always have a hard time saying that word. Create familiarity and strengthen intuition by applying the same solution to the same problem. Now, usually when people talk about design systems, consistency is sort of like the first thing people talk about. But for us, we felt that clarity and efficiency for our users were a lot more important. And then our fourth principle is beauty. Demonstrate respect for people's time and attention through thoughtful and elegant craftsmanship. So when you have your principles in place, this is basically how you can drive your design decisions. If you're in a design debate and you're trying to figure out, you know, does this need to be the same just for consistency's sake, or maybe we can change it in this one place because it'll provide better clarity or better efficiency. So when you're making those decisions, if you have your priorities in order, then you can like use that to determine the stack ranking. Obviously, you know, an inventory is very important for any design system. Some people do this with a Google Slides. Some people actually print out all their components, cut them up, and assemble them. But the idea is you do this with lots of different people, not just the designers, but you want to get execs in there, you want to get developers, you want to get PMs. And so if you want to learn more, this article on Illis Part goes into pretty awesome detail of how to do that. So let's talk a little bit about incubating your design system. So Nathan Curtis, pretty well-known dude when it comes to design systems. He writes a lot about them. I loved this article that he wrote about team models, which is a very common question that I hear from companies, especially smaller companies, like how should I form my team? And so he basically defines 3 models that he's seen, one being a kind of like what he calls the solitary overlords. That's obviously, you know, just in connotation of the way it sounds, like not the most ideal way to do it. He also talks about the centralized model where you have a centralized design team. And then he talks about the federated model where you have designers from multiple teams coming together and contributing to the design system. So as you do on Medium, I wrote a follow-up post to that post of how we do it at Salesforce. And it's really just a merging of the second and third model where we have a centralized team as well as a federated team. And we all work together and pair together. And there's no like top-down. It's very like we feed into their product design through our system, and they feed back into the system through their product design research and designs. I'm not going to say the name of this article, but there's this article that we use a lot at work, and it's basically another way of coming to a design decision if you're having disagreements. Cap Walkins basically proposed a way of if you give us on a scale of 1 to 10, a fruit or whatever other F word you want to use, then you kind of win out. So you would use this when you're unsure of like which way to go. And so basically, if somebody really cares a lot more about whatever the issue is, then they're going to win out. But nobody should ever pick 10, because that's not being very honest. Like, nobody should ever be a 10. And then I think it's really important to think very lean through the way that you embark on this adventure. So smaller sprints, focused sprints are really important. Marcin Tretter at UXPen has been writing these design sprint Medium posts. He has like a whole series of them where he'll focus on like a typography sprint or a color sprint. I think that's really great. Like, just pick one area and then focus on that. And now we're ready to release what we have, or as I like to call it, hatching. So when we were trying to sell this to our other colleagues and our engineers, the common thing that people would say were like, let's just like focus on buttons. We're just going to update all the buttons. And it turns out that it's not really quite as easy as it sounds. Buttons are really complicated. They have a lot of different states. Some of them are grouped. Some of them have like extra functionality. Like, it's not as simple of a component that you might think it is. And on top of that, if you're in a large organization like I am, you're going to get a lot of pushback from people because they just don't want to change their workflow. I don't know where this comment came from, but I always think about it with anytime we're trying to propose a new process. People just don't want to change their process because they're too busy, even though your process would really help them have a much quicker and easier time. One thing that really helped us is we were able to get executive buy-in, and once the execs saw the value of what we were doing, and a big part of that was just that our stuff kind of just looked better than what was in production, they basically mandated all the engineering teams would now have to adopt our stuff. And so that was super helpful. I highly recommend like getting your execs on board. And you might be wondering, well, like, how do you do that? I find it's always best to just show them, don't tell them. If you tell them, they're going to think about cost, they're going to think about time, they're going to think about all these different factors, they're going to think about maybe priorities that are more important to them. But if you show them, like, they'll see it and they'll understand it. And I have found this to be the case not just in my org, but a lot of the people I've talked to that are doing the same type of work in their org who have gotten exec buy-in, basically just kind of, I like to say, went rogue and just like built it, showed it. It doesn't even have to be a full-fledged design system, just like a proof of concept. And once they see it, they'll get it. I also think it's really helpful to open source it if you can, because then you get a lot of community help and feedback too. In some cases you can't. For example, like my friend Mina, who worked on the Hillary campaign, wasn't able to open source because there are a lot of people that would use that type of resource for nefarious purposes, which is unfortunate. And then one thing that we didn't quite consider right away, but looking back, we wish we had, was like really thinking about our marketing strategy. When we first started out with the design system, we weren't going to be called Lightning. We were just going to be called the Salesforce design system because that sounded like it had more longevity. Lightning is the name of the latest release of our UI, and we were concerned that Lightning would be like a temporary thing. But marketing won out in that battle, and everything was Lightning. And so if we had considered that before, we might have done like a lot of things a little bit differently. And now there's another big marketing push that's coming out this year, and so you'll notice a huge UI refresh change because it's all aligning to our marketing strategy. But this time we're ready for it because it's happened to us before, and now we're better prepared for it going forward. And now your stuff gets a little big. Like, people have noticed, people are using it, people are excited about it, people are talking about it. Everybody wants components 3 days ago, and they're just now telling you today. Like, this is when I think of the design system becoming like a really big dragon that you can't really quite control. Usually at this point in big companies, small companies, wherever you are, it's all about like trying to, this is actually the baby dragon. I got ahead of myself. So this is where you're trying to set yourself up to grow. So this is where you're aligning everybody, and what I like to tell people is that I talk to that get really super stressed out is like, just breathe, like, this is okay, we're all in this together. And so empowering designers, obviously, big goal for design systems. Initially, when we set out to do this, we thought everybody was going to design in the browser, because that's what we did. That was not the case, and so we realized that we have to help our designers as well through the tools that they use. So design system UI kits, people can use these in Sketch or in Vision or Figma or like whatever tool of their choice. And then in turn, empowering our developers. And I don't mean just the developers working on the CSS framework, but I mean the actual engineering team. So we do a lot of things for tooling, because we're on like a 4-month release cycle. So like when something goes out, it's out for like 3 months. So we have to like really make sure everything is like in place and everything is like trusted and like vetted. So we do that through things like design tokens for visual design, linting our code. We even made a Chrome extension for developers that'll basically grade it'll tell them like what pieces are actually using our design system and which pieces that they've overridden, and it gives them like an F if they override our stuff. So the whole goal is that they use this Chrome extension to kind of like clean up the old override code. Things like visual regression testing. We even have like a component previewer that we use internally, because we realized that building this like website on every time we're updating a component was kind of a bit heavy-handed. So now we separated out the framework from our site, and we just have a component previewer where we can see our code. And the idea is to stay living. I think this is like something you hear a lot with design systems, living design systems. And this is all about just keeping it updated, actually maintaining it. And the biggest way to do that is that it's part of your process. It's not something that you put on the back burner or wait till the end. Like, it's part of your entire process. Okay, so now we're at the big dragon part. Okay, so this is the part about like really like realizing how much your system has evolved, and sometimes changes are going to arrive, and you have to do a lot of optimization. There's this scene in Game of Thrones where Daenerys says, "I can't control them anymore." And the response is like, "They're dragons, Khaleesi. They can never be tamed." I would like to say that in the case of design systems, that's not really the case. Like, you can train people and educate people on how to use it. So you definitely want to educate people. We do this through so many different avenues. We have Trailhead, which is our kind of like, if you've ever used Treehouse or Code Academy, it's basically like our version of that, but specifically for the Salesforce ecosystem. So we can like educate people there. We do brown bag workshops. We do, just on like on-site visits where we can like help people know how to use the system. And a big part of doing a design system, especially if you treat it like a product, is support. So here's kind of where I'm going to talk about things that are a little bit real, and I think a lot of people don't talk about this part of design systems. Support is huge. Support is like a beast. So there's all sorts of things that we're having thrown at us right now. Like, we have devs that will override old code or like mash our code with other code, and then when they're seeing a bug, they inspect it, they see one of our classes, and they throw it at us. They're like, "That's your bug," even though they're not using it the right way. So this is like where we have to really like educate how these components are supposed to be used. And so this was initially done through documentation and advisory board meetings, standards reviews, audits, Chatter, which is our internal sort of like discussion board that we use, Slack, etc. But we realized, like, we could actually clear a lot of this up and automate it. So that's why we're doing our tooling, like the Chrome extension. We also have been working on a taxonomy system, so we can actually tell certain CSS classes like what it's allowed to go on, the restrictions, whether it's required. We have all this metadata now attached to all of our classes, so that not only do we show that in our documentation, but we provide a lot of tooling and automation and testing through that. And in design systems, I think a lot of people think you're going to build it and then like you're just going to always be consistent and always follow it. That's not really how it goes. Like, you're going to change your mind. And like a pretty good example of this is even just our documentation. We've changed the layout of our site for our components so many times, just based on like different research methods that we've tried, people we've talked to, different feedback we get. We'll add a feature, then we remove the feature, we'll move it to the top, then we'll put it in a modal, then we'll put it in the sidebar. Like, we change it a lot. We're trying to stay like pretty iterative and respond to the feedback that we're getting from our users. But yeah, you're going to be changing your mind a lot. And then you're going to be changing your mind a lot again. Another example of this is namespacing. When we first started out, we just had simple classes like button or tabs or data table. And then we found out because people were combining us with things like Bootstrap or Foundation or whatever other framework, that they were getting clashes. So luckily this happened during our alpha. So we went back and namespaced all of our classes. And by the time it was released, everything was namespaced. And then you're going to change your mind again. So unfortunately, after a year and, gosh, I don't know how long it's been out, we realized that we had to change our syntax entirely. So we try to be agnostic. We are used on many different platforms because we have a developer ecosystem where people are using us on all sorts of different stuff. And we were using BEM for our naming structure, which involves double dashes. It turns out that our production compiler is XML-based, which means our devs that were trying to comment out things were getting big fat errors. And we found like a workaround that would work where they would have to configure a setting and then they would be able to comment. But that puts overhead on our developers. And so what we decided to do was to actually deprecate the old classes and add the new classes, which unfortunately makes our CSS look a little bit big right now, but through your tooling, you can strip those out if you need to. Kind of a bummer, but hey, things happen. And speaking of deprecation, it's really important to have a really good deprecation strategy. I think initially when we were starting out, who does the little comments with to do, remove? You're never going to go back and remove it. Like, you're going to get busy. So we open sourced a SAS mixin that basically wraps the deprecated code. You pass in the version that you want it to deprecate in, and then once it hits that version, it no longer compiles. And then it'll throw a warning in your console so you know to go and clean it out. So here's where I'm going to suggest something that is actually the opposite of what we're doing right now, but it's something I really believe. I think silos are a bad idea for design systems, and what I mean by that is splitting everything up. So initially when we started out, we had this really awesome hybrid cross-functional team of visual designers, interaction designers, front-end developers, like all these people working together. And I thought it was great, and we moved fast. Unfortunately, we've grown a lot. We've become a big dragon. And so now we have a visual design team, and we have a patterns and components design team, and we have a front-end team, and a hybrid like me just is sort of like, where do I go? Oh, I guess I'm stuck on the front-end team because they need code. So I don't think it's a good idea, and this is something that I do see big companies do all the time. When I was at Apple, they did the exact same thing. I personally really believe that a good design systems team should be cross-functional, and you should embrace your hybrids. So we went through the growth stages: egg, baby, big dragon. Basically, what I'm trying to tell you is design systems are an investment. I think like a lot of people, including myself, have given talks where they paint like this really rosy picture, but it is work. It is definitely work. But I think through good like human guidance combined with internal tools, it's definitely worth the investment and it's worth the effort. But I also want to remind that design principles are so much more important than design standards. It's okay to break your rules. Sometimes you need to, because it'll align better to your principles depending on what your context or feature is. And you can totally be creative. I hear people always complaining about how design systems stifle creativity. They don't. They just like give you all the easy like pieces, and then you can like build it and like do whatever you want. So what I like to tell people that are doing design systems, like it's okay to let go. It's okay to break the rules sometimes. It's okay to have what we like to call the special snowflakes, where things are just going to be different. So if you want to get connected with a really awesome community of over 2,100 design systems folks, the Slack that I run is designsystems.herokuapp.com. It'll automatically invite you. It's a really awesome Slack, and I've learned so much from the community there. There's so many great people in there. And as Mark mentioned, I do have a design systems conference in November. And there's also a new design systems conference I'm excited about, which is in June, called Patterns Day. I'll be speaking there. And then there's also meetups popping up in San Francisco. I started the San Francisco Design Systems Coalition, and then we give talks at like different companies, and then or those companies are the ones giving the talks. And there's already a New York chapter run by Diana Mounter for New York City. There's also a mailing list, designsystems.curated.co. Lots of like relevant links, and then obviously styleguides.io is like the huge repository of like links and podcasts and examples and articles and so on. You can also just tweet at me if you have any questions. My name's Jina. Thanks.